looks like it has kind of a larger heart-shaped or lobed leaf scar with two little eyes and a smiley face in it. Some people call it a little monkey face. And so if you see that leaf scar, you know right away you're looking at a black walnut. It's just very diagnostic. Other trees have very different leaf scars as well, but that's just something else that we'll use at times. And so again, these all look very different, right? So the black walnut, the little monkey face on the top right. There's a very big leaf scar on the bottom center. That's Kentucky coffee tree with some huge bundle scars. There's the red maple leaf scar that kind of hugs up underneath of the buds with some real noticeable bundle scars. And then of course the shield-shaped leaf scar of green ash in the top left, right? So very different, very distinct, and you can identify these trees simply from a picture of the leaf scar. And twigs will often be have different levels of hairiness as well. And so they can vary from completely smooth, hairless, all the way to very hairy or pubescent, you call it. And then the hairs can be different conditions, different colors, different lengths. On the bottom left there, that's mockernut, which is one of the hairiest twigs around. And you can see it has these kind of whitish yellow clusters of small hairs kind of densely covering the whole twig, right? And then of course, the white oak on the top right, smooth and not a hair on it. So we look at the twig sometimes at the conditions of the hair, the colors of the hair as well. And then the locations and kind of other characteristics you may use and that you can identify things. And one of the ones that first come to mind are the oaks. And so oaks, which are any species in that Quercus genus, we have 20 different species here in Illinois. They tend to, not always, but tend to have their buds clustered at the tips of the branches. So what that means is there's basically a terminal bud, but then there's a whole cluster of lateral buds that are crowded right against that terminal bud, close to the tip of that twig. And so we see that in most oak species. It's kind of a common characteristic. So if you're out there and you're looking in the winter and you see a twig and there's just a big group of buds right at the end of it, that's a good indication that you may be looking at an oak twig. So something else we look at, and this is very similar to what we look at in the summertime with leaves. So leaf arrangement is something that is important for tree ID, especially in the summertime or in growing season. You want to see if the leaves are growing opposite or alternate to each other. The same thing holds in the wintertime, that we're looking for that arrangement. Of course, we don't have leaves, so we have to use other characteristics to figure out the arrangement. And buds are something that really work well. You can even use branching. And so they fall into those same categories as the leaves, where we have some tree species that have twigs with alternate buds, which means there's one bud at a time. It may be one bud on the right side of the twig, and then it comes down a little bit, and there's a bud on the left side of the twig, but it's one bud at a time, and it kind of alternates along the twig. So those are alternate, and the majority of our tree species kind of fall into that category. But we do have a number of species that have opposite buds. And so that's a case where you have two buds coming out directly across from each other, like the picture on the right there. So maples are a great example of that. So those are kind of the two broad different characteristics of or kind of options for bud arrangement. And you can see that, you can pick it out pretty easily. The picture on the left there, you see there's one bud, then the next bud, then the next bud. So that's clearly alternating along the stem. So it's an alternate arrangement. And on the right, it's very clearly an opposite arrangement. You see on the top there, there's two buds that are clearly across from each other. It is important to recognize that you want to look at multiple examples on a tree when you're trying to figure out if it's opposite or alternate. There are times when a bud may have been damaged and died, and so there's only one bud remaining, and so it may look alternate if you just look at one place, but it's actually opposite. Or there's a time when a twig is very slow growing and it crowds those alternate buds really close to each other, so they appear opposite. So don't rely just on one quick glance. Look at multiple twigs if you can to try to really decide kind of what that arrangement is. One of the challenges with tree ID comes from the fact that a lot of times the buds and the twigs are way up in the tree and you just can't see them easily from the ground. So you can still get at this arrangement question, even if you can't see the buds real clearly, because many times the branching is also in that same pattern. So having binoculars or just looking up into the tree and then trying to see the prevailing arrangement of the branches in that tree. Are they alternate? Are they opposite? And that can clue you in on the bud arrangement as well. So here we have on the left a picture of a black walnut. And if you look at that, you can see the majority of the time there's one branch coming out, one branch coming out, one branch coming out. But then sometimes there's two, right? There's every once in a while there's two, but overall it's one branch at a time. And so that gives you a good clue that you're looking at an alternatively arranged tree there. But on the right, we have an ash, and you can see on this one, it's very clearly the majority of the time there's two branches coming out. Two here, two here, two here, two right there. So everywhere you look, the majority of the time you have two branches. And so that's very clearly opposite, even though you can also easily find the occasional single branch where it may look alternate. That's why you have to kind of look at the overall picture. But even if you can't see the buds, you should be able to still get a sense of whether it's opposite or alternate just by looking at the branching arrangement, particularly of the smaller branches. And then there's this weird category that's not opposite or alternate, and there's just a couple species that fall into this, and that's whorled. And whorled basically means there's three or more buds or leaves kind of radiating out from the same point. You can see in this catalpa picture on the right, both of these ranks of buds, there's three buds coming out from there. So if you find a woody plant that has more than two, three or more buds coming out from the same place, opposite of each other, then you're looking at it, it's a whorled plant. Very, very few species fall into this. So if you find that, it's usually a pretty easy task to narrow it down from there. Just a couple more things on twigs. The pith, which is the center of the twig, can be very varied, and it can actually be used as a method of identifying trees as well. Sometimes the pith are dark, sometimes they're star-shaped, sometimes they're light-colored, sometimes they're hollow or large and spongy or small. There's a bunch of different characteristics, but in this case, you would probably want to bring either a set of clippers or a pocket knife with you for not only cutting the branch off to look at it like this, but also peeling the branch longitudinally so you can expose the pith and see it that way as well. Not for every tree, but in some cases, it can be a very important characteristic. And so here's just some of the different conditions that you may find pith in, right? On the left, you see a solid pith. It's a different color, but it is a solid, hard pith. Next to that is a hollow pith, where the pith is just, there's no material in it whatsoever. And then a soft, spongy pith. And then on the right is a chambered pith, right? So you've got these little diaphragms in there to make it chambered. All different characteristics, all very different, but also very useful in identifying each of those species. So that's kind of the quick review, right? And that's just kind of the things that we're going to look at. And now that we're going to move into the tree species, we're going to use those characteristics to describe each of the species. We'll talk about its arrangement, its twigs, its buds, kind of all of this. Before I do that, I wanted to do a very quick little knowledge test. So I'm going to show a next slide is going to have three species, three pictures on it, A, B, and C. And I want you all to tell me which one of those is an oak species. So put in the chat box A, B, or C, and let me know which one of these is an oak species. All righty. Everybody is putting in there, and everybody is right. That is awesome. Excellent. Thank you all very much. Glad to see so many people participating, and you're all right, right? So we say we have A, everybody's answering A, and indeed that is right. I'm hoping you all looked at the clustered buds towards the tip to get that to get to that answer. And so the one on the left, A, is a shingle oak. It's one of our black oak species. And then we've got a black gum in the middle and a red hickory on the right. So, right, very easily there. So we're looking at those clustered buds. Good job. So let's move into, I got a couple more things. Sorry, I got a couple more things I forgot that I put in here. Just a little bit about the bark before we, in the form, before we get into the actual tree species. There's bark comes in a lot of different conditions, a lot of different ways, and we kind of identify it or describe it with certain terms. And so these are some common terms you'll see when we're describing bark. So on the top left is ridge and furrow. So this is typically linear ridges which come out and furrows which go in that are noticeable and very separate like that. So you see these long lines running up and down the tree. These long ridges. So a lot of trees kind of fall into that ridge and furrow. Sometimes the bark is thin and it's peeling away or flaking away. So we have flaky peeling bark like you see in the top middle. Typically the bark is going to be flexible on that case and peeling. That differs from platy, which is on the bottom, which looks similar where it looks like the bark is peeling, but that is going to have hard, inflexible bark. So that usually flaky and peeling, the bark is flexible and thin. Platy is going to be hard and non-flexible. Shaggy is similar as well to platy, but it tends to come off from the bottom or top of the bark and peel up instead of peel from the side like in big plates. Tight bark or smooth bark doesn't peel really at all. It's just kind of really tight and smooth. And then some bark that is not really in noticeable lines or ridges, maybe in just little chunks. So we call those blocky. And you can see that on the bottom right there where it's not an obvious ridge. It's just big chunks of bark in kind of irregular shapes. So these are all just different ways to describe bark. And bark is something as once you get a sense of tree bark, you can often identify trees just from a glance at the bark alone. But something else that's important before we get into the tree species is the form of a tree. Some trees grow in recognizable, consistent forms that you can pick out even at 60 miles an hour driving down the interstate. And so kind of figuring out how this tree grows, what it looks like, what's its overall growth form can be important for identifying trees in the winter and can just make it easier to pick those species out. We won't go into a lot of detail on this, but just a couple of examples here. So on the left, we have a pin oak, and pin oaks, their form is usually strongly pyramidal. So you often have some of the lower branches that are descending a little bit or pointing downwards. And then as you go up the tree, they kind of move and start pointing strongly upwards and get narrower. So the overall shape of the tree is strongly pyramidal in shape. And contrast that to an American elm, like on the right, which is often almost the opposite, where you have strongly vase-shaped, where very narrow acute angles of the branches and then kind of straight. So it really does look like a V strongly with that tree. And then something like a post oak, which typically is very, very rounded in canopy. And so you can see this post oak here with a large open spreading crown, a very rounding canopy, which is very different than the pin oak we saw earlier. So sometimes form, habitat, where it grows, some of these things can also be very important. And so, understanding if a tree is planted in a yard or something, habitat may be a little less able, but if you're looking at trees in the wild, it can be very useful to identify that tree. You know that certain trees grow in low wetlands, certain other trees grow in dry uplands and so forth, or any unique features that you might see. And so this is a honey locust here. And if you see those big woody branch thorns on a tree, then you know that's such a unique feature that you can identify it right away you think it's a honey locust. So unique features can be very useful. All righty, now we're going to move into our species. There's a lot of different maple species. What I'm going to do now is hit 3 of them that I think are useful to identify, and we'll talk about the top 3: box elder, red maple, and silver maple, and identifying those in the winter. All three of these maples and all maples here in Illinois, in fact, are oppositely arranged. So those buds and branches will be opposite. And then in the growing season, of course, the leaves will be opposite as well. Let's start with box elder. So box elder, a lot of people don't even necessarily realize that it's one of our maples, but it is. It is opposite arrangement, as you can see in these pictures. The buds on box elder are really rounded, they're not pointed, and they're white hairy. So they often have white woolly hair on the buds. And then the leaf scars often are strongly V-shaped and actually meet up with each other around the twig. And so you can see that on the picture on the bottom left. You can see the leaf scars kind of creating this V that remains on the small twigs. One really easy characteristic to pick out box elder is that the leaves, or the twigs, I'm sorry, are usually green. They're not always green, but often they're green in color, and there's very few woody plants that have, green twigs. Sometimes they can be purple or even reddish or dull or tan in color. But if you see one that has a lot of bright green twigs that are opposite, then it's a good indication that you may be looking at a box elder. The twigs are often kind of waxy too, so they're not hairy. You can rub off kind of this waxy covering on them that'll rub off in your hands and give you this kind of coat. So that's another way to identify it. Of course, box elders are found all throughout Illinois in every county. The bark on box elder on the bigger branches is going to be a light tan. It's typically really smooth on younger branches with some raised lenticels. And then as it ages, it turns kind of a shallow ridge and furrow with age. And another good characteristic for box elder is it often holds onto its fruit well throughout the winter. So its fruit are the little helicopters, the samara. You'll see those often hanging on box elders any time of the year or all throughout the winter. So that's another kind of good thing to look for in the wintertime. But for me, I look for that light tan bark, and those green twigs really are what jump out to me for box elder. It is a medium-sized tree, and oftentimes you'll have a lot of branching from the trunk. And so a lot of little branches, epicormal sprouts from the trunk, especially when it's in the open. It typically is a spreading or irregular canopy, so it's usually not a strong, central leader. Again, those sprouts are pretty common, and you see this a lot in kind of open, disturbed sites. It likes flood zones, floodplains. It likes old fields, roadsides, any place with a lot of light and a lot of disturbance. It seems to do really well in those conditions. So that's quite a bit different than our next maple, which is red maple. So red maple is also opposite, but their buds of red maple are usually pointed or rounded. They can have both, but they're red in color, and they usually have hairs at the scale margins. And you can see that in the big picture on the screen now. If you look at the scales on those buds, you can see they're red in color, but then right along the edges, the margins of the scales, you see a lot of white hairs. The leaf scars are U-shaped, kind of and tucked up right against the buds, of course. The twigs are slender. They're usually red or brown or maybe even gray in color. And again, this is what we mentioned earlier. This will have some twigs. This species will have some twigs with small pointed buds and other twigs with clusters of rounded buds, and those are going to be the actual flower buds for red maple. The bark is light gray. It tends to turn darker with age. So on really smooth on the smaller branches, and then it forms kind of narrow vertical plates on larger trees. So kind of a platy ridge and furrow, if you will, but it still kind of has that darker gray color to it. So red maple is a medium-sized tree. It usually doesn't get that big. Kind of an upright nature on smaller trees, kind of grows real tall, but as it ages, it typically gets a more rounded canopy. This is really one of the true habitat generalists. You see it growing everywhere from low, swampy, wet woods all the way even into drier ridges. So you do see this kind of across the whole landscape. Now, silver maple is one, when they are young, it can actually be very difficult at times to tell a young silver maple from a young red maple. Their buds look very similar, their twigs look very similar, even their bark when they're younger look very similar. But as at the age, it becomes easier and easier. The silver maple, like all maples, are opposite. The buds are reddish, pointed, or rounded, very similar to red maple. Flower buds are clustered and rounded as well. They have hairy scales at the margins and U-shaped leaf scars, all very similar to red maple. Typically, it's probably less red in color, but again, those vary. The one way you can kind of separate them if it's a younger tree and you just have little twigs is if you take your thumbnail and you scratch the bark or the buds, especially the bark of a very young twig, and then smell it, it has kind of an unpleasant smell. So silver maples don't smell that great, and then red maples don't really have much of a smell at all. So if you kind of scratch it and smell it, and it's somewhat of an unpleasant smell, then you're probably looking at a silver maple. As the tree ages, the bark looks similar to red maple, but then it does tend to get a little more shaggy. And on larger trees, it'll often have a twist to that, to those, the bark. It'll kind of twist and turn as it goes up the tree. So again, that narrow platy or shagginess is usually more so than you see in red maple on larger individuals. And then, of course, this is a medium to large tree. You can usually get a lot bigger than red maples, broad, rounded canopies. It tends to form some major branches low to the ground, low on the trunk. And so you often don't have a clear trunk that goes a long way up. Instead, you get low branches and multi-trunked specimens. This grows in bottomlands and riparian areas primarily naturally across all of Illinois. You'll find it in those kind of wet woods, though it is also very, very commonly used as an ornamental, particularly in older houses. You'll see silver maples planted in front of them. So you could be looking at silver maples in the uplands if it was planted there. So you got to kind of pay attention to that as well. So those are our maples. Again, there's other maples. I know Taryn covered sugar maple, and there's several others, but just to kind of give you an idea of those, we're going to continue here with another opposite species. And so there's several dogwoods out there. A lot of them are kind of classified as shrubs. This is the one that the one native that we primarily consider, tree size. And so that's flowering dogwood. Flowering dogwood is used as an ornamental kind of throughout all of the state. Though naturally occurring, it's in the southern 2/3 of the state. And so flowering dogwood's a little different in its buds in the sense that oftentimes you'll see these big rounded flower buds at the end of the branch. So that's not really a terminal bud. It's actually a flowering bud. And it kind of looks like a big Hershey's Kiss. So that's what's going to form the flowers the next year. And then the other buds, the lateral buds, are usually really tiny and kind of even hard to pick out sometimes. This one is opposite. So it's oppositely arranged. Again, those Hershey Kiss shaped, big or onion shaped flower buds. If you look at the lateral buds on the side, they're small, reddish and pointed, really tiny. And then the twigs are slender. They're kind of greenish to red in color. And then to me, they often curve up at the tip. And so that really, I'll show a picture of it in a second, that really jumps out to me is kind of the way that all those twigs curve upward as they get towards the flowering bud. And that kind of stands out and you can pick it out even at a distance. In terms of its bark, it has that real blocky kind of octagonal alligator skin bark to it, especially on older individuals, right? You can really see that on the picture on the right. When it's young, it tends to break into kind of square thin blocks, but it really gets that kind of thick alligator skin kind of bark as it gets older in age. And that really is unique to flowering dogwood. There's not a lot of other species that look like that, and usually you can pick them out just even from that bark characteristic. But here's the picture I was talking about on the bottom left, where you can really see those buds sitting, the flowering buds sitting at the top of those branches that are curving upwards right at the tip. And to me, that jumps out really easily when you're trying to identify flowering dogwood. And this is a small tree. This is an understory tree. It rarely gets bigger than, say, 6 inches in diameter and 20, 30 feet tall. Sometimes you can get some bigger than that, but usually this is going to be an understory species. It does really well in kind of rich forest and coves primarily, but you'll see it growing in edge habitats, growing canopy openings. You'll see it planted a lot as an ornamental as well. So it's a very common tree. But even in the winter, picking it out, it's the two things that I key in on would be the kind of warty, blocky bark, alligator type bark, and then those twigs that curve upward to meet the really big flowering buds. All right, we'll move away from opposites for a little bit here, and we're going to talk about hackberry. So I chose hackberry on here because it's such an unusual looking tree, and it's found throughout the entire state. So hackberry is an interesting one. It's alternate, as I mentioned, and it actually lacks a true terminal bud. And so if you see that little picture on the center, there's a bud on the end of it, but you can see it's kind of coming off and pointing to the side. That's actually a lateral bud that's just right at the tip, and they typically don't have a true terminal bud on them, and that's just a little bit unusual. There's a few trees that have that. Those lateral buds usually are strongly triangular. They're small and often lay flat against the twig, but sometimes they stick out like you see there. But the big thing about hackberries are the twigs are very, very thin in diameter, very thin kind of twigs, often with a strong kind of zigzag nature to them. So it zigs from one bud to the next bud, and instead of being a straight twig, but just very, very thin. It'll have light colored lenticels all over those twigs. And then again, those kind of triangular flat buds stand out. Leaf scars are very, very tiny, hard to even see without magnification sometimes. One thing that's interesting with the twigs of hackberry is if you cut into them, normally the pith is solid in a hackberry. So most points on that twig, you cut into it, you'll have a solid pith. But if you get to a place where there's a node or where two branches separate from each other, most oftentimes the pith can be chambered just in that part of the twig, which I think is kind of funny. I'm not really sure how that works, but something like black walnut, which has the entire pith is chambered, this again is only at those nodes, and a small section of the pith will be chambered, where the rest of it will often be solid. So cutting into it can really show you this, but then you got to focus on where the branching occurs on those twigs. But hackberry is something that's pretty easy to identify just by its bark. So you don't even often need to look at the twigs. So the bark is probably one of the most recognizable species by the bark that we have in all of Illinois. It's a smooth bark overall, tight bark, light gray, but it forms these layered warts. And so if you look at them, they're stiff, hard protrusions that come out that are layered. They're stratified, right? They've got all these little layers on them, and it doesn't break off easy. They're really hard. And this varies in the amount greatly in hackberry. So you can have something like the picture on the left there, where there's warts, but overall it's kind of smooth. And then as you go on those three pictures on the bottom, you can see it goes all the way to where those warts have coalesced so much that it almost looks like ridges on that picture on the right. Again, they vary all over the place. You can have two trees next to each other, and one would be really crazily warty and the other's fairly smooth. There's just a lot of variation in hackberry. If you're in far southern Illinois, there's a related species called a sugarberry, which looks a lot like a hackberry. They're hard to tell apart, but it occurs farther south in the U.S. and gets into the southern parts of Illinois. It typically has a little bit less warts, but there's a lot of variation. So in the winter, they're really hard to tell those two apart, actually. But hackberries, they're a medium to large tree. They can get really big. This tree tends to be pretty straight. So oftentimes it'll have a strong central leader. It'll go way up and be a tall, straight tree, often with many, many feet of branchless trunk leading up to it on the larger trees. And then if you look up in it, you see those thin little branches, those numerous thin branches, numerous thin twigs will jump out to you for this one, just really, really tiny branches. This is a habitat generalist. You'll find hackberry growing in a wide variety of sites, all the way from disturbed sites into lowlands, into closed forest. It really kind of grows everywhere. All right, so we're going to stop for another knowledge test, and we're going to have you name a tree. So I'm going to put up a picture here, and then let me know what tree, put in chat what tree you think it is. All right, so what do we have there? This is plenty enough information to identify this one. All righty, everybody's doing a wonderful job putting it in there. Everybody's putting box elder, and somebody was showing off and putting Acer Negundo in there. That's quite all right too. Happy to see scientific names. Right, so I'm assuming everybody got that from, you can see the opposite branches there on that top one, and you can see the strong green color, right? So box elder definitely there. Really good job, everybody. At this point, Zach, do we have any questions that you want me to address now, or should we move on?
We've got a few questions here. If you want to backtrack to maybe something recent like the maples or dogwoods, would that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I think it's a good time to kind of take a breather, stop and answer some questions, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So, do all species of Acer flower in the early spring before leaves come out?
That's a good question, and the interesting thing, so red maple is often our first tree to flower. So here in Southern Illinois, red maples will flower even into late February, and they really jump out. And I haven't done enough observation to really answer that question. I do know that last year I was really trying to take pictures of all the different maple trees in flower. And I noticed that sugar maple was a lot later in the season than the others, and kind of box elder was in between. But I think they may have started leafing out at that point. So I'm going to say no. I think there's enough variation in there, but I need some more observation really to answer that question.
All right. So we'll address a few more. So of all the maples you mentioned today, which one is the best planted in a home garden, assuming that space isn't an issue?
Oh, that's a good question too. It's really what you're looking for. So I think that there's a lot of cultivars out there of red maple that have some beautiful fall color. There's some cultivars of sugar maple that have beautiful fall color. If you're not interested in necessarily a cultivar, you're looking for a straight species. I think both of those do really well. I do know that actually maples tend to be overplanted a little bit in terms of there's a lot of them on the landscape, and so there's a little bit of a concern about having too many maples in our residential areas, just because if you all remember back when we lost a lot of elms due to Dutch elm, it was really impactful because there was such a high percentage of the trees in residential areas were elm. Once all of them died, we lost a lot of our canopy. We saw the same thing with ash once emerald ash borer came in. So I definitely like maple. I say use them, but be aware that there's lots of maples planted, and it's the #1 tree that's planted right now. So there's a bit of a concern with that. So kind of consider some of these other species that are less planted, and I think that'll just be a better way of adding diversity into our residential planting.
Okay. And we'll go ahead and do one more here, Chris.
Sure.
So, any suggestions for separating sugar maple from black maple in the winter?
Oh, that's a good question too. And I'm going to have to beg off on that one because we don't really have black maple here in Southern Illinois. So I don't really look at it a lot in the winter. I can identify them in the summer, but I just haven't spent a lot of time separating them because I don't have to down here. So I'm gonna say that I'm sure there's a good way to tell them apart, but right now I do not know it. So I just can't answer that question.
All right. Well, we've got plenty more here, Chris, but if you want to proceed, we can address those at the end. Up to you.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and move on then and cover some more species. Those are really great questions, and I look forward to answering other questions moving forward. Well, oh yeah, that's box elder. Let's jump into the next group of species. So ironwood, this is another understory tree species. It's also called eastern hop hornbeam. Pretty common, found in every county in the state. Often an overlooked species because it's small, it's in the understory. A lot of people assume they're looking at a little elm or something and just don't pay attention to it. But it's very, very common. I can almost guarantee it's in your woods. If you're any kind of woods other than like real low wet woods, you're likely to have a lot of ironwood in there. It is alternate. You can clearly see in the picture on the right. The buds are small and sharply pointed. Small, long, pointed buds, overlapping brown scales, some slight hairiness to the buds as well. And they typically arise from the twigs at a broad angle. So like the hackberry, the buds are often very tight to the twig. On ironwood, they're often spreading and kind of angled away from the twigs, and it really jumps out to you. You can really see that when you look at an ironwood twig. Twigs are very, very thin twigs. They can be smooth and they can be hairy. There's a little variation in them, but they often hold some leaves throughout winter, and that's a good characteristic for ironwood in the sense that it has those marcescent leaves, those leaves that kind of hang on. They're already dormant. The leaves have senesced, but they just don't fall off. And so ironwood is one of those that often hangs onto its leaves a long time. Sometimes that leads to this being misidentified as a beech twig or a beech sapling, because beeches will do the same thing. They'll hang on to their leaves, and they kind of are the same color in the fall. But this is one way you can often pick out ironwoods. It's because it has a few leaves hanging on it. Ironwood bark is peeling and flaky. So this bark is thin, it's flexible, and it's usually in these long, narrow vertical strips. But often, especially as it gets older, those vertical strips will start to peel and curl a little bit and flake off very easily. You can usually put your hand on it and run your hand over the bark, and you break off a lot of those little peels. They come off very easily. And if you notice on bigger ironwoods, often you'll look at the direction of those long vertical strips, and they often twist along the main. So they don't go straight up and down the trunk, but they tend to twist around the trunk as you follow them up the trunk. And that's on older individuals, larger individuals, that's usually very noticeable. This is a small understory tree, and it's usually a single straight trunk. So it doesn't have a lot, usually not branched. It doesn't have a big rounded canopy. It has a thin canopy, usually a single straight trunk, single tree coming up. And then it has thin lateral branches, and the branches are usually pretty thin in diameter and then often arise at a very obtuse angle, right? Almost a right angle or nearly a right angle coming out from there. So small branches coming out almost perpendicular to the ground really is a good characteristic to pick out ironwood kind of at a distance. All righty, that's ironwood. Let's move to another one of my favorite trees out there, sassafras. So sassafras is an unusual tree for Illinois. You know, it's in the Laraceae family. It's very fragrant. It's the same family as bay leaves. It's actually used for cooking in some places and spices. But it's found in the southern 3/4 of the state, not used as much as an ornamental, but a beautiful tree nonetheless. So it's alternate arrangement. The buds are large and green with overlapping scales. And then I'm talking about the terminal buds here, are large green terminal buds with overlapping scales. The twigs are often green in color. They may be black or reddish as well, but a lot of times they're going to be smooth and waxy, and you can rub off that wax, and underneath you'll see a very clear green color. And they're pretty thick. You know, this is a fairly thick twig on a tree. We had just looked at hackberries and ironwoods, which are generally thin twigs, very thin twigs. This is on the thicker side of twigs. And just like the dogwood, they typically curve upwards towards the tip. Each branch does. And then if you break open a twig or you scratch the bark of a twig, it's going to have a really aromatic smell. I say it kind of smells like Fruit Loops cereal, but it really stands out. And sometimes in the winter, you're going to have to, again, break a twig or really scratch that bark to get that smell. But it's very noticeable once you get it. So as it ages, it has those green twigs, and as it ages, the bark gets kind of a real dark reddish brown, almost dark burnt orange color to it, and it can be really, really thick bark, ridge and furrowed, often kind of forming somewhat of a diamond pattern. And then many times especially on the middle-aged, not the really big branches, but not the little twigs, but kind of the middle-aged stems. A lot of times the furrows in the bark will be kind of a silver color to them. And you can see that in that picture in the center right here, where you see that kind of silver color on the inside, the lower parts of the bark. And it really stands out, but it tends to only be in those kind of medium size stems. If you slice into it, it really shows that kind of burnt orange or dark orange inner bark. And then even the bark is going to be fragrant and kind of smell like Fruit Loops. A lot of people have an easy time to identify sassafras when the leaves are on or when they're young, and don't really recognize them as they get bigger. They may mistake them for anything from walnuts to hickories, just because of that kind of thick furrowed diamond-shaped bark. But really it's that color, that kind of reddish brown color of the bark, and when you slice into it, that kind of burnt orange coloration really stands out for sassafras. This is typically a small to medium-sized tree, though they can get big. They don't often get big, but I've seen them 30+ inches in diameter before. Usually it's small to medium-sized. It's a clonal tree, so a lot of times you'll see big groups of it growing together. And then a lot of times when you see these big clusters of them, they have kind of a twisted, scraggly appearance. So they don't grow straight. The branches are curved or scraggly. There's a lot of dead branches on them, things like that. It really kind of gives it kind of a trashy look a little bit, because there's a lot of dead branches in there. But in those kind of big clusters of smaller stems really are a good way to kind of pick them out if you see them growing in fence rows or something like that. This is typically a very shade intolerant tree, so which means that you'll find it in open areas. It's one of the first species to kind of move into prairies or into pastures, forest edges, fence rows, really where you'll see this species a lot. But again, you can see in the bottom left there, those branches are curving up at the tip, and you can see those large terminal buds. So that's sassafras. Here's another kind of fence row tree or pasture tree. Honey locust. So honey locust is an interesting one because it is kind of this fence row tree or a field tree or pasture tree, and it's one that people don't like, but it's also very commonly used as an ornamental. Now, of course, the ornamental ones are typically the thornless varieties, so you can't just go on thorns to identify them, but it's very commonly used as an ornamental as well as kind of a disturbed site tree. So when you're looking at honey locust, the interesting thing about it is that the buds are really small and basically hidden. You almost can't see the buds. Right around the leaf scars, there's usually a swelling on the twigs, and the bud is encompassed inside of that swelling, so you can just barely see the bud poking out right there on that picture in the center. It's kind of almost covered over by the leaf scar as well, or that swelling. They're kind of recessed down into those swollen nodes. So you're looking for kind of a reddish or brown color to the twigs. Very, very strong zigzag pattern with swollen kind of nodes on there. Really jump out, and that's kind of a way to identify it as honey locust. Even the twigs sometimes may have some of those thorns, but that's certainly not always the case. As it gets older, for thorned individuals, it becomes very easy to identify it, right? You have these large woody branch thorns that grow in clusters on the stems and on the branches and kind of everywhere. If you have that, it's easy to identify. Outside of that, you're looking for really dark gray bark that tends to become broadly platy with age. And so you have these big flat plates that'll peel off on the side, and then in the fissures underneath the plates or the breaks in the bark, it often has a real reddish coloration to it. And so that jumps out. Even if you don't have thorns, that becomes that kind of slate gray or dark gray with the reddish inside, really gets you to honey locust. So honey locust is a medium to large tree. Sometimes they can get quite large, particularly when it's in fence rows or pastures that often have multiple trunks, twisted appearance, kind of poor form tree. Sometimes in residential settings, they have a better form to them. But overall, honey locust has a pretty wide habitat tolerances. It actually prefers bottomlands. That's where it grows the best, though it does a great job of readily colonizing kind of any disturbed area. So again, fence rows, pastures, old fields, you're likely to find this kind of in abundance. Really, if it has the thorns, it's easy to identify. It has those long, curled seed pods that often will remain on the tree well into winter, or you can see them laying below the tree in winter, which also makes it pretty easy to identify it. So here's just a picture of some young honey locust saplings coming up in a pasture. Alrighty, so here's another one that, even though it only occurs naturally in the southern third or so of the state, I decided to include sweet gum because it is a commonly used residential tree, commonly planted that way. So I thought it was a good one to add to our list here. So sweet gum is an alternate branch, like some of the others we've been seeing here. Big tree, but if we're looking at the twigs, it's an unusual twig, and it has one of the larger terminal buds. Those buds are going to have those imbricate overlapping scales. Sometimes the scales themselves may have a dark tip or coloration to them. They can be green, brown, red in color, and they're often sticky. They're resinous. So there's a lot of resin that's produced at these buds on these scales. And if you rub your hands on them or try to peel one of the scales back, it often is pretty sticky. And then the leaf scars on the twigs are U-shaped or kind of rounded in color, and it has 3 noticeable bundle scars that occur in the middle of the leaf scar, and you can see that on the top right up there. Twigs are usually pretty stout, and on younger sweet gum trees, they're often very corky. They have these big corky wings that occur on them, and then on older trees, you often don't see that, but younger trees, it's usually even very, very noticeable with really big corky wings. And you can see that on the bottom left there. That's a sweet gum twig or branch, and you can see how really corky that is. It almost looks like a wing down. Sweet gum bark is really thick, so it's very thick bark, but it's typically spongy. So I always say you can you can stick your thumbnail in it, and it'll leave a depression in that bark. It's so soft, right? So it's very thick bark, but very, very spongy, very soft. Kind of a rounded ridge and furrow. It can be very, very thick or not so much. There's a lot of variation in it, but again, you're looking for that soft texture, the soft feel to the bark, and kind of an overall, usually dark gray or dark brown color. Sweet gum's a large tree. They can get very, very big. It's a tall tree with a very straight trunk in a forest situation. In a kind of open grown, it can be more open and spreading, but typically it grows, it's a fast growing tall tree. It is also a clonal tree and can form pretty dense patches of young trees or young sprouts in disturbed areas. And this typically is a tree of wet bottomlands or wet riparian areas. It loves wet fields or other disturbed sites. It'll just completely colonize those. Often in the winter, you can see the little gumballs hanging on the branches as well, which makes it a real easy way to identify it. But again, it can be a very tall, very straight tree, but it's also commonly used as an ornamental. So this is one, I just wanted to show this picture. This is the state champion, or was the state champion sweet gum. It may have been beaten recently, but a really big tree, and it was 130 some feet tall. Just a big, beautiful tree growing in kind of its native habitat. All righty, let's move on to another one of my favorite trees, Redbud. So we put Redbud in here because it is also a common ornamental tree, but it's also a native tree found pretty much throughout the state. Redbuds lack a true terminal bud, just like in the hackberry we saw. And the lateral buds on Redbud are tiny, really dark brown and rounded, and it usually has a very white margin. Really, really unusual looking buds. And they kind of sometimes occur in these big clusters, which are the flower buds occur in these clusters right on the twigs. So they have these, looks like little growths, but if you get a close look at them, it's just scores of little buds all clustered together, and those are the flower buds. The twigs are typically slender and very strongly zigzag in nature on redbuds. Redbud bark is dark brown, almost black sometimes in coloration. It could be scaly or platy or almost even flaky at times as it gets older. And then as the bark breaks up, the inner bark is often like a reddish coloration. You can kind of see that in those central two pictures there where it has that real reddish color. But as it ages, it typically gets darker and darker. And again, it's dark gray, dark brown, almost kind of black in coloration on older individuals. And redbud is a small tree. It doesn't get very big. Usually short trunks and branches low to the ground, or even multi-stemmed coming out of the ground. It often has spreading, open, kind of limby canopies, irregular shaped canopies with those low branches, right? So it's really, really kind of an open, spready kind of style of a tree. And you'll see it in the forest, but usually if it's in a forest and growing in a mature forest, it's often at the canopy openings or places where there's enough light. But it does well in forest edges, old fields, any place like that. It can actually get pretty weedy fast and then spread quite a bit, even into home landscapes, things like that. One of the things that you can pick up on in winter is all those clusters of flower buds often leave kind of scars. And so you have these like rough, scarred, rounded scars on the small branches that remain. And then you can often see the little short seed pods that hang on often well into winter as well. So it makes it a fairly easy tree to identify at any time of year. All right, so I'm going to move into the oaks now. We're going to cover several oak species. And again, we're looking for, on oaks, those clustered buds that are clustered towards the tips. We have, broadly speaking, we have red oaks and white oaks. Red oaks generally have narrow pointed buds, and white oaks generally have more rounded buds, but there's a lot of variation. So I'm not going to cover a lot of the species, just a handful here that weren't covered last week. But I'll start with pin oak. So pin oak, like all oaks, are alternate, and their buds, pin oak buds, are sharply pointed, reddish brown and smooth, really no hairs whatsoever to them. For an oak especially, pin oak has slender twigs. A lot of the oaks are fairly stout twigged. Pin oaks are fairly slender, brown and smooth, really no hairs whatsoever. And then interestingly enough, that oftentimes the petioles of the leaves will remain on the twigs throughout the winter. So the leaf itself will break off kind of at the junction of the leaf, the leafy tissue and the petiole will remain. And you can see that on that picture on the left there, where you have several petioles kind of staying on that. I don't necessarily know why it does that, but it's very common in pin oak you'll see a lot of remnant petioles hanging on. The bark on pin oak is very thin, tight barked. It's often light colored to ashy gray in color, but especially for an oak, it's some of the thinnest or tightest bark of oak species. It's almost described as smooth or very lightly furrowed, right? So very tight bark, very light furrows, if at all, kind of a light ashy gray color. And pin oak, as we mentioned earlier, is really a pyramidal shape, right? It's a thin canopy, a narrow canopy, very thin branches, and overall pyramidal shape to it. They can get large. They can be a very large tree, but even on big trees, you'll still typically have that pyramidal shape. Lower branches on pin oaks usually droop, and a lot of times once those lower branches shade prune themselves and they die, which is a natural occurrence on many trees, they don't shed those. So they hang on to their lower dead branches a lot longer than many other trees. So if you see an oak with tight bark, a lot of dead branches, lower dead branches that are drooping, that's a good indication that you may be looking at a pin oak. Pin oak is a species that really likes poorly drained, wet soils. I mean, it grows in swampy areas, bottomlands, all of these. It's kind of where it naturally grows, but it is widely planted, and you'll see it planted anywhere on the landscape throughout Illinois. One that looks a little bit like pin oak is shingle oaks. There's a bit of difference, but we'll go into here in a detail here. But shingle oak is another alternate like all oaks. Another one like pin oak that has sharply pointed reddish brown buds and slender twigs, right? So all that's very similar to pin oak. The bark tends to be a little thicker than in pin oaks and a little more ridge and furrow. Although it does vary a lot. So it'll have generally broad ridges and shallow furrows and kind of ashy gray, kind of like a pin oak, but in my experience, it's more platy and thicker than you see in pin oaks. And it doesn't tend to retain those lower drooping branches as much. Overall, pin oak is a poorer form tree, I call it. It typically is very limby. The limbs will droop quite a bit. They kind of spread. It doesn't have a real strong leader or often a large trunk. It typically holds a lot of its leaves well into winter as well. So you'll see a lot of those branchless or those lobeless leaves, unlobed leaves hanging on. And then like a pin oak, shingle oak often has a lot of those horned or gouty oak galls, the big woody galls. You can see those on smaller limbs many times, kind of hanging on to these trees as well. But overall, you know, you're looking at for shingle oak, it likes the uplands. It grows in the uplands. It's a little bit more of a less strong pyramidal shape than pin oak. And so there's some ways in the winter that you can easily tell them apart. The next is Bur Oak. And so Bur Oak is a very, very different tree. This is one of the white oak groups for oaks. So the shingle oak and the pin oak were the red oaks. So its buds are bluntly pointed. So large buds, often covered in a slight gray fuzz, kind of blunt as they are. The twigs are often very stout, tan colored and smooth. And then oftentimes those twigs will have very corky ridges to them. So to be thick, corky bark, even on the twigs. And of course, Bur Oak is found throughout all of Illinois. Dark gray bark, very thick vertical ridges, very deep furrows, some of the thickest bark and deeply furrowed bark we have of any tree. And the smaller branches and twigs often with corky ridges, like you can see in the picture there on the bottom left. And this is a large tree. It can get very, very big, although it often has a short trunk with wide spreading thick branches. So it often is not a tall, it doesn't have a large trunk without any limbs. It's usually a big, well-rounded canopy, kind of spreading tree. And this one grows in a wide range of habitats. We often think of Bur Oak as that classic savanna species, right? Growing right at the edge of the prairie. which it certainly does, but it often it will grow very well in riparian areas and right along stream sides as well. So you kind of see it in both of those environments. And one that gets mistaken for a Bur Oak a lot or mistook, and so there's sometimes it's hard to tell apart, is swamp white oak. Swamp white oak is a little bit misnamed, where people think it only occurs in the swamps. It actually has quite a bit of habitat generality as well, and can grow in a lot of places. Its buds are rounded or blunt as well, very similar to Bur Oak, can be smooth or slightly hairy, and it also is very stout twigs. A little bit different than Bur Oak, where Bur Oak often has corky, thick bark. A lot of times the twigs of swamp white will have flaky or peeling bark. So thin bark that peels or flakes off, and you can see that in that central picture. And that's a pretty common characteristic on swamp white, and a great way to tell it apart, particularly on young individuals from Bur Oaks if there's no leaves. The bark is similar to Bur Oak in the very large trees where it has thick kind of furrowed bark like that. But again, you want to look at those smaller stems, the smaller branches, and you should see that flaky peeling bark that really jumps out to you. And that's a way to tell them apart in the winter. And this one's a large tree, right? Broad, rounded canopy, thick, short trunk often, large, low lateral branches. Bottomlands or moist uplands, usually, although it has wide habitat tolerances. And it is one of those that will often retain its leaves throughout the winter. And the leaves in the winter even will still show that kind of white coloration to the underside of the leaf, which really makes it easy to pick those out if there's leaves on them. And so just to look here at the two side branches. So the best way to tell them apart if you're unsure is to look at the smaller branches. The picture on the left is the corky, thick bark of Bur Oak, and the picture on the right is the flaking, thin bark, peeling bark of swamp white oak. All right, we're time for another knowledge test to name that tree. So let's see what this one is. All right, so based on this alone, what tree do you think this is? All right, answers are coming in. I'm happy to see what everybody's putting in. Everybody's looking like they're getting it right. Excellent. So this is indeed a redbud. You can tell by those rounded, really black, dark black buds with the white margins that really stand out like no other tree out there. And then you can kind of see the reddish color to the inner bark on the picture on the right. So absolutely a redbud. Good deal. I've got a few more things. I'm not going to stop for questions now. We're going to go through this one and we'll stop for questions at the end because I've just got a few more slides here. We're going to cover a handful more species. We're going to cover one hickory only. So this is one that I wanted to cover just because it's so different and it's actually easy to identify, very easy to identify in the winter, probably the easiest of all the hickories, which is bitternut hickory. So bitternut hickory is one of the pecan hickories. And so the pecan hickories in Illinois are pecan itself, bitternut hickory, and water hickory. They have these valvate buds, right? So they're not the overlapping scales that you see in all the other hickories. They really have different buds. And bitternut hickory buds are sulfur yellow in color. That really stands out. You can really see it in these pictures right here. And that's the easiest way to identify this tree is by those bright sulfur yellow buds. If you see that, you know what you've got. There's no question. The twigs are thin for a hickory. Most hickories are fairly stout. This one's relatively thin, light gray, typically hairless as well. The bark is the tightest bark of all the hickories, and it's often the lightest color. So it's a light gray, almost kind of a shiny gray or shiny silver coloration, kind of very shallow, flat ridges that are shiny. So to me, it jumps out. It almost doesn't look like any of the other hickories because of that really light coloration to the bark and the flat kind of shiny ridges. It will have that broad diamond pattern that you see in other hickories, but it's one of the easiest ones to identify outside of shagbark just by the bark because of that weird coloration and that kind of shininess to it. It's a medium-sized tree. It doesn't get that big. Usually very tall, straight trunk, narrow canopy. It's one that has a wide habitat suitability, everywhere from bottomlands to kind of drier uplands. It's very common on the landscape all throughout Illinois. And then if you dig around below them, you can find often the hickory nuts, and they're winged throughout the top half of the hickory nut, which is very unusual. And also an easy way to check to make sure that you got bitternut hickory. All right, a couple more. One that I really like to talk about is Ohio Buckeye, and we're back into the opposites. So most everything we've talked about, except for a couple early on, the dogwood and the maples early on, most everything else we've talked about have been alternate. Ohio Buckeye is an opposite species, and it is easily identifiable by its extremely large, sharply pointed terminal buds. Those buds are really big, big, thick twigs. The scales on the terminal buds are often a little bit ridged. You'll have a little ridge along them. And then if you look at the leaf scars of Ohio Buckeye, they're going to be big, stout leaf scars with 3 noticeable bundle scars inside of it. But overall, big, thick, opposite twigs and with really big terminal buds will get you to Buckeye. It really looks like nothing else. The bark is tight, smooth, light gray in color. As it gets a little older, it'll get a little bit of texture to it, and usually soft and kind of spongy. You may see somewhat of a diamond pattern to it. Or you may see kind of thin, rounded plates, almost kind of circular plates in there on older trees as well. But really kind of an unusual bark to it, and tight, but soft. It's a small to medium-sized tree. Ohio Buckeye typically doesn't get very big. Usually has short trunks, crooked growth, oftentimes multiple trunks, drooping branches, irregular canopy. Just kind of an unusual little tree like that. You find Ohio Buckeye mostly in moist coves, well-drained bottomlands, rich soils. It tends to prefer limestone-based soils a little more than acidic soils. And it's reported to have an unpleasant odor, but I've never been able to pick up on that actually from the twigs. But for me, I pick it out just, again, those opposite branching and the incredibly thick twigs with the really big buds will get you at Ohio Buckeye easily. Alrighty, staying with these kind of thick twigged species. Kentucky coffee tree is another one. It's probably the thickest of all the twigs of any tree native to Illinois. It is alternate, and the buds are small and they're sunken into the twig. And you can see that in both of these pictures here, where you see the buds are just little disc kind of arcs. The rest of it's all sunken into the twig. The pith is large, very spongy. So if you break open a twig, it's going to have very spongy pith. Leaf scars are very large, U-shaped with very noticeable big bundle scars in it. And then the twig itself is very stout, mottled in appearance. It'll often hold on to the petioles or the leaf rachis well into winter as well. But really, you're looking for very, very stout twigs with very, very big leaf scars and those sunken buds for coffee tree. The bark is very variable. It differs from being kind of more straight ridge and furrow and thick, but oftentimes it has kind of a platy nature or a curling nature with thin plates or ridges that kind of interlace with each other, and it gives it its weird lacy looking look to it. Sometimes if you look underneath of those, you can see kind of a pinkish inner bark as well. But to me, I really pick out the thick twigs, often holds the rachis or the stem of the leaves on well into winter, and that kind of peeling bark on the younger branches, that kind of lacy bark really jumps out to you. This is a medium-sized tree, thick twisted branches, irregular canopy. It can often grow in dense patches, especially in disturbed areas. And then a lot of times you'll see these heavy, short seed pods either on the trees or laying on the ground below them. But especially I look for those stems, the rachis, the leaf stems that are retained on the branches well into winter. And that's really one of the best characteristics that I pick up on in the wintertime. This is a habitat generalist. It grows in a lot of places, but overall prefers kind of moist, well-drained bottomlands. And what I think is the last tree, and if you were here at the beginning, you may have seen me mention that this is probably my favorite tree. For some reason, I just really like black gums. I think they're very interesting and beautiful trees. They are alternate, and they also have moderately stout twigs, and they have large pointed buds, particularly the terminal buds are large and pointed, often a little hairy in color, hairy in texture, kind of varies in color from dark brown to reddish. And then if you look under the lateral buds, they have this kind of reddish smiley face leaf scar with 3 kind of perfectly rounded bundle scars. You can see that on the picture on the lower left, just really a neat looking leaf scar to it. Overall, again, moderately stout twigs, tan to gray coloration, fairly smooth on the young twigs. And if you cut into the pith of black gum, it's going to have a chambered pith, but it's solid. So we saw the picture of the black walnut, which has a hollow pith with the little diaphragms creating chambers. And then we saw the hackberry that had just a small section of it was that way. This one, black gum, if you cut into its twigs, you'll have a solid pith, but if you look at it, you can see the divisions in there or the chambers, and I've kind of marked them in red there so you can kind of see them. Just another unusual thing. It's a neat characteristic that seems to be unique to black gum. So black gum has dark gray bark. Sometimes it gets almost nearly black. Sometimes it's lighter gray in coloration, but thick, blocky bark, broken ridges. If you peel back or drill into it, it'll have kind of a yellow-brown inner bark to it, but just a lot of kind of unique texture and interest into its bark. It's a medium-sized tree. Branches are thick and crooked. Oftentimes the branches come out at near right angles to the ground. So a lot of times those branches aren't ascending or descending, but they're almost parallel to the ground. It has broad habitat suitability. It grows anywhere from well-drained bottomlands to dry uplands, and it tends to prefer acidic soils. But again, one of my favorite trees, I really like black gum. I think we have one more tree. Yep, one more, which kind of can get mistaken for black gum quite a bit because the bark looks somewhat similar. But that is a persimmon. And so we'll end here with persimmon. It's also alternate. Its buds are small, dark brown or black in coloration and triangular in shape, and then are tight to the twig with a little smiley face leaf scars below them that doesn't have any real noticeable bundle scars. The twigs are a little slender, so not very thick, and usually smooth and hairless. The bark persimmon is dark brown and black and blocky. You can often have that orange inner bark underneath of it. You can see in the fissures. And the small stems are usually smooth with really noticeable orange lenticels. And those lenticels will grow into the bark and coalesce, with age. But it goes all the way from smooth with those lenticels to kind of really, really warty and blocky on older individuals. Really a unique looking bark. And persimmon's a small tree, medium maybe sized, thin canopy, usually pore formed. It's usually not straight, a lot of crooked growth. And it is a habitat generalist. It's another one of those fence row trees. But that bark coloration and that texture really jumps out to you for persimmon. So just kind of in summary, as we're finishing up here, just as recommendations, don't try to just recognize a tree. Don't look at it and say, oh, I'm just going to recognize this in the future. That's usually not the best way to learn your trees. Instead, practice describing these characteristics. Name what twig arrangement or bud arrangement it is. Describe the twigs and buds, the bark, the form of the tree, and kind of get used to using that terminology and picking it out when you're in the field. And then you can use those to narrow down the options. And that's really a better way to kind of learn your trees than simply trying to recognize them. And certainly use reference books or apps to help when needed. Take pictures to review them later, things like that. And so I'll just mention a couple of good resources that I think are useful for people that are kind of just getting started. So the Winter Tree Finder, I think, is a great little resource. It covers a lot of the species we have in Illinois. It's cheap, it fits in your pocket. It has a great little key to go through. So I would recommend anybody starting out to buy one of these and kind of keep it with you if you're looking for to identify trees in the winter. It's one of the ones that I use when we do in-person classes on winter tree ID. An old book, but one that I used years ago and I still find it very useful, is The Woody Plants in Winter by Corin Ammons. Has really good graphics in there, good displays or drawings, good keys in there. So I think it's a great resource, even though it's getting a little old now. The taxonomy is outdated, but still good solid information in that book. Got to put a pitch in for Forest Trees of Illinois. That's the University of Illinois Extension Forest Trees publication. We have a lot of tree species covered, including a good key to the trees in winter in there. And the one I really like is this Native Trees of the Midwest by Sally Weeks. It's a general guide. It's not just a winter guide, but it goes over a lot of the winter characteristics, and it's just a great kind of reference book. It's a big book. It has lots of good information. So if you're interested in trees of the Midwest, I would highly recommend that one as kind of a source material for you to keep on your desk. It's big enough that you're not going to carry it into the field necessarily. All righty. So with that, I believe I'll leave off here with this final slide. It has my email on there. Don't be afraid to get a hold of me if you have questions about tree ID or other things forestry related.